search dog froze in the middle of the woods, eyes locked on the base of a hollow tree, like he knew something the rest of the team didn't. They caught up, brushing it off as a scent trail gone cold. But the dog didn't move. He growled, quiet and deep, and backed away, never turning his back on the tree. They looked inside, expecting trash, maybe a dead raccoon. What they found made the commander go silent. Because it wasn't trash, it was a human arm. Now, before we get into this story, tell me in the comments, do you think dogs can sense death before we do? And if you love grounded animal stories that feel real, hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss what's coming next. The early morning mist clung to the pine branches like ghostly fingers as Officer Clara Vaughn adjusted her utility belt and checked her watch. It was barely 6 a.m., but she'd been up for hours already, that familiar knot of anxiety in her stomach that always came with missing person cases. Beside her, Oaks, her 4-year-old Belgian Malinois, sat with military precision, his ash-gray coat still damp from the morning dew. His intelligent amber eyes scanned the tree line with the focused intensity that had made him legendary in their department. "Another Sunday morning ruined, huh, boy?" Clara murmured, reaching down to scratch behind his ears. Oaks leaned in her touch briefly before resuming his alert posture, every muscle ready for action. The woods behind Marrow Creek weren't known for danger. Most locals considered them peaceful, thick with pine, rarely traveled off the main trails, mostly serving as a backdrop for weekend hikers and amateur bird watchers taking photos for their social media feeds. That's exactly why the call about Curtis Brome had surprised everyone at the station. Clara had taken the initial report from Curtis's sister the night before. The woman's voice had cracked with worry as she explained how her brother, a quiet handyman in his late 40s, never missed their weekly Sunday breakfast tradition. 15 years we've been doing this, she'd said. Rain or shine, Curtis shows up at my kitchen table at 8:30 sharp, and he always calls if something comes up. Always. Search and Rescue had dispatched a team by early afternoon Saturday, operating under the assumption it was a routine case. Maybe Curtis had twisted an ankle on one of his frequent solo hikes, or gotten turned around, chasing what he thought was a shortcut back to the parking area. His beaten-up Ford pickup was still sitting at the entrance to Trail 9B, keys on the dashboard, cell phone dead in the glove compartment. Commander Weston, a 20-year veteran with silver hair and the weathered face of someone who'd seen too much, had requested a K-9 unit out of standard protocol. Clara and Oaks had worked with Weston before. He was the kind of leader who trusted his people's expertise and never micromanaged. When he'd called Clara directly, she could hear the underlying tension in his voice that suggested this might be more than a simple lost hiker situation. Clara had been partnered with Oaks for 3 years now, ever since she'd transferred to search and rescue from patrol. The transition hadn't been easy, losing her previous partner, a German shepherd named Rex, to cancer had nearly ended her career. But something about Oaks's intense focus and unwavering determination had reminded her why she'd fallen in love with K-9 work in the first place. Oaks had been what the trainers politely called challenging when they'd first met. Too intelligent for his own good, with a tendency to work independently rather than following standard protocols. 3 handlers had given up on him before Clara, but she'd recognized something in his stubborn persistence that reminded her of herself, a refusal to quit when others might walk away. Their breakthrough had come during a training exercise 6 months into their partnership. While other dogs were content to find the planted evidence and move on, Oaks had continued searching, eventually discovering a second cache of contraband that the instructors had forgotten about from a previous session. That's when Clara realized his disobedience was actually extraordinary thoroughness. Now, as she clipped on his working harness and let him sniff Curtis's flannel shirt retrieved from the truck, Claire watched that familiar transformation take over. Oaks's playful demeanor vanished, replaced by laser-focused professionalism. His head snapped up after one deep whiff of the fabric, ears forward, tail rigid. The scent had triggered something in his highly trained brain. He was locked onto a trail that only he could perceive. "You got something?" Clara asked softly, recognizing the subtle shift in his body language that meant he'd found what they were looking for. Oakes didn't bark. He rarely wasted energy on vocalizations during serious work. Instead, he immediately began moving off trail, pulling Clara through the thick brush and damp leaf beds, following an invisible trail that his nose was reading like a road map. His pace was deliberate but urgent, the way he moved when he knew they were running out of time. "Let him work," Commander Weston called out to the other team members, who were preparing to spread out in a standard grid pattern. He'd learned to trust Oakes's instincts over the years, watching the dog solve cases that had stumped human investigators. Clara followed her partner through the undergrowth, her boots crunching on fallen pine needles as they moved deeper into the forest. About 40 minutes into their search, she noticed the terrain beginning to shift. The canopy grew thicker overhead, casting the forest floor in premature twilight despite the morning hour. A strange, almost resinous smell hung in the air, definitely pine, but mixed with something else she couldn't identify, something that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. That's when she noticed Oakes's hackles rising. Not fully, but enough to signal that he was encountering something that put him on edge. His pace slowed from an urgent trot to a deliberate stalk, each step calculated and cautious. He paused at an old fallen log, investigated it thoroughly, dismissed it as unimportant, then veered toward a slope lined with gnarled tree roots that looked like claws scraping at the earth. Clara had learned to read her partner's body language like a book. The way his ears twitched forward, the slight tension in his shoulders, the deliberate placement of each paw, all of it told her they were getting close to something significant, and probably something she wouldn't like. Suddenly, Oak stopped dead in his tracks. They were in the center of a natural ring formed by towering fir trees, their branches intertwined overhead like cathedral arches. Oak sat down with the deep, motionless alertness he reserved for his most serious finds. His nose angled toward a massive, hollowed-out tree trunk in the center of the clearing. Its center rotted through and blackened, creating an opening that gaped like a mouth. Clara frowned, studying the scene. "That's not normal behavior," she called back to Weston, who was approaching through the underbrush with two other team members. "What's he looking at?" Weston asked, his voice dropping to match the somber atmosphere of the clearing. That's when Oakes did something that sent ice through Clara's veins. He growled, a low, rumbling sound that she'd only heard from him twice before, both times when they'd discovered human remains. Clara pulled her flashlight from her tactical vest and approached the hollow tree slowly, every instinct telling her she wasn't going to like what she found. The beam cut through the darkness inside the trunk, illuminating shadows and damp moss at first. Then, the light caught something that made her blood freeze. She recoiled so quickly she nearly dropped the flashlight. Jesus Christ. Inside the hollow, wrapped in what looked like an old tarp or canvas, was a human arm, severed cleanly at the elbow, the skin pale and waxy. The fingers were curled in an unnatural position, and around the wrist was tied a strip of linen bearing a crude symbol, a triangle intersected with a circle and a jagged slash that looked like it had been drawn in blood. Commander Weston's voice went hoarse when he saw what had shaken his most experienced K9 handler. "Get back up here now, full forensics team, and close off all the trails. Nobody else comes into these woods until we figure out what we're dealing with." Clara stepped back from the tree, her hand finding Oakes's head for comfort as much as to steady herself. The dog remained perfectly still, watching the hollow with an intensity that suggested he knew this was just the beginning of something much worse. As if summoned by their discovery, rain began to mist down through the pine canopy, adding an even more ominous atmosphere to the scene. Clara couldn't shake the feeling that they'd stumbled into something that had been waiting patiently for them to find it. The rain intensified as backup units began arriving at the trailhead, their red and blue lights painting the forest in surreal, flickering colors. Paramedics remained at the parking area. Nobody was injured in any way they could help with. The forensic team worked methodically to secure the hollow tree and document the grisly discovery, but Clara noticed Oakes becoming increasingly restless as they worked. The Belgian Malinois kept lifting his head, ears rotating like radar dishes as he tested the air. Clara had worked with him long enough to recognize when he was processing multiple scent trails, sorting through the complex information that his extraordinary nose was feeding his brain. "You're getting something else, aren't you?" she asked, half hoping she was wrong. But Oakes confirmed her fears by pulling against his lead, his eyes fixed on a different section of the tree line. Without warning, he bolted forward with an urgency that Clara had rarely seen from him. She had no choice but to follow, calling back to Weston as they disappeared into the underbrush. "Where are you going?" Weston shouted after them. "I don't know," Clara replied, "but I'm not letting him go alone." Oakes moved with purpose through the dense undergrowth, taking them roughly 60 meters northwest of the first tree. Clara's heart sank as she realized he was leading them toward another ancient tree. This one, with bark split and peeling like weathered skin. Oakes circled the base once, then lowered his body to the ground, pressing his nose against the earth in the unmistakable posture that meant he'd found more human remains. Clara already knew what they would discover before she even approached with her flashlight. The second hollow contained what appeared to be 2 feet, still wearing a faded purple sock on one. They were bound together at the ankles with some kind of cord and wrapped in the same canvas-like material they'd found at the first site. Tucked inside the wrapping was another piece of linen bearing the identical triangle circle slash symbol. "This isn't random dumping," Clara said, when Weston caught up to them, his face pale in the flashlight beam. "Someone's staging this deliberately. They wanted these to be found eventually, but only by someone who knew where to look." "Or someone with a nose like his," Weston replied, nodding toward Oakes, who had resumed his methodical scanning of the surrounding area. The discovery of the third tree 20 minutes later confirmed their worst fears. The hollow in this ancient oak held a human torso, no head, no limbs, just the body wrapped tightly in the same material. The chest bore crude carvings that were too deep and deliberate to be anything but intentional mutilation. Restraint marks on what remained of the arms told a story of prolonged captivity before death. "I've been doing this for 30 years, the lead forensic technician said, shaking his head as he photographed the remains. "I've never seen anything this organized, this methodical. Someone took their time with this, someone who knew exactly what they were doing, and someone who knew this terrain intimately," Weston added, studying the spacing between the trees. "These locations weren't chosen randomly. Look at the sight lines, the natural concealment. Whoever did this has spent serious time in these woods." Clara watched Oakes work, noting how he'd found all 3 locations in less than an hour of searching. His ability to detect decomposing human remains was exceptional, but this was beyond anything she'd seen from him before. It was as if he was following a map that only he could read. The fourth discovery changed everything about their understanding of what they were dealing with. The tree was massive and ancient, twisted into a shape that seemed to lean forward in perpetual grief. Oakes approached it differently than the others. Instead of his usual confident alert, he circled the base while whining softly, a sound Clara had never heard from him before. When she investigated, she found no obvious hollow opening, just a narrow gap between the twisted roots. They had to dig carefully to reveal what lay hidden beneath, a human head, wrapped separately from the other remains. It was intact and almost peaceful looking, with eyes closed as if simply sleeping. A small blue ribbon frayed with age still clung to the hair. "That confirms it," Weston said, his voice heavy with the implications. "This wasn't disposal. This was placement. 4 trees, 4 body parts, 4 identical symbols. We're not dealing with a simple murderer." "No," Clara agreed, studying the careful arrangement. "This is ritual, ceremonial, someone with a very specific agenda." The crime scene team worked to establish a perimeter around the entire area, but Clara couldn't shake the feeling that Oakes wasn't finished. The dog continued to pace slowly around the clearing, his body language indicating he was still processing scent information. His nose tested the air constantly, and his eyes never stopped scanning the forest around them. "There's something else out here," Clara told Weston. He's telling me this isn't complete yet. As if responding to her words, Oakes suddenly focused on a specific direction and began walking with renewed purpose. Not running this time, but moving with the deliberate certainty of a professional who knew exactly where he was going. The fifth location was unlike the others. The tree was healthy and whole, showing no signs of natural or artificial hollowing. But the ground around its base told a different story. Flattened grass, scuff marks in the earth, evidence that someone had spent considerable time kneeling in this spot recently. Claire brushed aside the wet leaves and pine needles, revealing a symbol carved directly into the bark itself, not drawn or painted like the others, but etched deep into the living wood with a sharp tool. The same triangle, circle, slash design, but beneath it was something new that made her blood run cold. The Roman numeral V, 5, and below that, attached to the bark with a small metal staple, was a laminated photograph. Not of remains this time, but of a living person. A young woman in her late 20s, sitting on a bench somewhere, laughing at something off camera. The photo was clearly printed from a home computer, not professional quality, but clear enough to make the subject easily recognizable. Clara flipped the photograph over with gloved hands and found writing on the back in blocky, deliberate letters. "She speaks next." "This isn't about victims already dead," Clara said, her voice tight with realization. "This is a schedule, a promise. Someone is planning their next move." Weston took the photo and studied it grimly. Whoever's doing this isn't running or hiding. They want us to find this. They're communicating with us. That's when Clara noticed the trail camera, barely visible among the branches about 10 feet up, positioned to capture anyone who approached this tree. The camouflaged casing was sophisticated, clearly designed to avoid detection by casual hikers. "They've been watching," she said, as Weston carefully removed the camera with evidence gloves. "They knew we'd find the bodies. They wanted to record our reactions." A systematic search of the area around the fifth tree revealed fresh boot prints, adult-sized, with a distinctive tread pattern that would help identify the wearer. The prints led away from the tree toward a thick patch of undergrowth, but they didn't follow any natural path. Someone had been deliberately trying to obscure their trail. Near the base of the tree, Oakes pawed at the ground until Clara investigated what had caught his attention. Buried just beneath the surface was a thin chain necklace with a cheap locket charm. Inside the locket was a tiny piece of folded paper with childlike handwriting. "You look too late the first time. You won't be early again." The message sent a chill through Clara that had nothing to do with the cold mountain air. This wasn't just about the bodies they'd found. It was about other victims, other crimes that had gone undiscovered. Someone was taunting them with their failures while promising more victims to come. "Run those boot prints through every database we have," Clara told the forensic team, "and check missing persons reports for anyone matching the woman in that photo. We need to find her before whoever's doing this decides it's time for her to speak." As the afternoon wore on and more specialists arrived at the scene, Clara found herself studying the arrangement of the 5 trees with growing unease. When Weston showed her the GPS coordinates plotted on a topographical map, her suspicions were confirmed. "They form a perfect circle," he explained, pointing to the 5 marked locations, "exactly equidistant from each other. The positioning is mathematically precise." "And the 5th tree, the one with the photograph, it's dead center," Clara observed. "The bullseye of whatever ritual this represents." The forensic anthropologist who'd been called in to examine the remains confirmed what they'd all suspected, but hoped wasn't true. The dismemberment had been done with surgical precision, using tools that suggested medical knowledge, or at least extensive anatomical training. The spacing of the burial sites and the preservation of the remains indicated someone with sophisticated understanding of decomposition and forensic investigation. "Whoever did this has been planning it for a long time," the specialist explained. "The symbolic elements, the precise spacing, the ritual aspects. This isn't the work of someone acting on impulse. This is the culmination of extensive preparation and practice." As the sun began to set, and portable lighting was brought in to continue the investigation, Clara noticed Oakes becoming increasingly agitated. He wasn't alerting to specific locations anymore, but his entire demeanor had shifted to high alertness. His ears were constantly moving, tracking sounds that human ears couldn't detect, and his body remained tense despite the long day of work. "What is it, boy?" Clara asked, following his gaze toward the darker sections of forest beyond their established perimeter. Oaks whined softly and took a few steps toward the shadows, then looked back at Clara as if asking permission to investigate further. Every instinct told her they should wait for the full daylight and additional backup before venturing deeper into the woods, but Oaks had been right about everything so far. The decision was made for them when one of the perimeter officers radioed in a report of movement in the forest. Someone in dark clothing who'd been spotted briefly before disappearing deeper into the trees. The sighting was roughly in the direction Oaks had been watching. "That's our guy," Weston said grimly. "He's been out there watching us work his crime scene." "Clara, how confident are you in Oaks's tracking ability in low light?" Clara looked down at her partner, who was practically vibrating with the desire to pursue whatever scent trail he detected. "If there's a trail to follow, he'll find it. But sir, if we're dealing with someone who's been planning this for months or years, we need to assume they're prepared for pursuit." "Agreed. Full tactical support, night vision, the works. But we follow that dog." The pursuit through the darkening forest felt like something out of a nightmare. Oaks led them along trails that barely existed, through thick undergrowth and around fallen trees, following a scent that seemed to be leading them in a rough circle around the crime scene. Clara began to suspect they were being led rather than following, drawn deeper into the woods by someone who knew the terrain far better than they did. The first sign that they weren't alone came when Oaks suddenly stopped and went rigid, his body language shifting from tracking mode to defensive alertness. In the distance, barely audible over the sound of wind through the trees, came the sound of something large moving through the underbrush. "Contact," Clara whispered into her radio. "Someone's moving parallel to our position, approximately 50 meters northeast." The response came in the form of a spotlight beam that cut through the trees like a sword, illuminating a figure in dark clothing who immediately bolted deeper into the forest. But Oaks was already moving, his powerful legs carrying him through the undergrowth faster than any human could follow. Clara lost sight of both the suspect and her dog in the chaos that followed, crashing through branches and stumbling over the hidden obstacles as she tried to keep up. The tactical team's radio chatter filled her earpiece with updates on movement and positioning, but all she could focus on was the sound of Oaks barking somewhere ahead of her in the darkness. When she finally found them, the scene was almost anticlimactic. Oaks had cornered the suspect against a rocky outcropping, not attacking, but maintaining a perfect defensive position that prevented escape. The man was older than Clara had expected, probably in his 50s, with a wild beard and clothing that suggested he'd been living rough for some time. His hands and arms were covered in dark stains that could have been mud or something else entirely. "Easy there," Clara called out as the tactical team surrounded the area. "Oaks, hold position." The suspect didn't resist as they approached with weapons drawn. In fact, he seemed almost relieved to be caught, as if the long game he'd been playing had finally reached its conclusion. It wasn't until they had him in restraints and were leading him back through the forest that Clara realized this arrest was just the beginning of something much larger and more disturbing than a simple murder case. The interrogation of Joseph Mahler, as they eventually identified him, revealed the scope of what they'd stumbled into in the woods behind Marrow Creek. The man had a history that spanned 4 states and nearly a decade, always connected to remote forest areas, always involving reports of strange activities that local law enforcement had never been able to prove. "He's been living off the grid for years," the FBI agent assigned to the case explained to Clara as they watched Mahler through the one-way glass of interview room 3. No permanent address, no employment records, just a pattern of squatting in abandoned cabins and camping in restricted areas. Every time he was picked up, it was always near dense forest land. Clara studied the man who'd orchestrated the ritualistic murder scene they'd discovered. He sat calmly at the metal table, his hands folded, occasionally glancing toward the mirror as if he knew they were watching. There was an intelligence in his eyes that disturbed her more than wild ravings would have. "What bothers me," she told the agent, "is that he's too calm, too organized. When we found him in the woods, he didn't fight, didn't try to run. It's like he wanted to be caught." "Or like being caught was part of his plan," the agent replied grimly. The investigation that followed would span months and involve multiple agencies, but it began with Oakes leading them back into the forest at first light the next day. If Mahler had been active in these woods for an extended period, there might be more evidence, more victims, more crime scenes waiting to be discovered. Clara had barely slept, her mind replaying the events of the previous day and trying to process the implications of what they'd found. Oakes, by contrast, seemed energized by the successful completion of their search. He moved through the morning routine with alert enthusiasm, as if he understood that their work wasn't finished. "You ready for another day in those woods, boy?" Clara asked as she checked his equipment one more time. Oakes responded with a soft bark and the focused intensity that meant he was ready to work. The return trip to the crime scene felt different in daylight. The forest that had seemed so ominous and threatening in the darkness revealed itself to be just trees and undergrowth, marked now with police tape and evidence markers. But Oakes wasn't interested in the areas they'd already searched. His attention was focused on sections of the forest they hadn't explored, places where his nose was telling him there were more stories to uncover. The sixth discovery came within an hour of resuming the search. Oakes led them to a depression in the ground where decades of fallen leaves had created a natural hollow. Beneath the organic debris, they found what appeared to be the remains of an improvised campsite. Fire ring made from gathered stones, scattered pieces of camping equipment, and most disturbing of all, items of women's clothing that had been carefully arranged rather than simply discarded. He brought them here first, Clara realized, studying the layout of the camp. This is where it started, before he moved them to the ritual sites. The forensic team's analysis of the campsite revealed evidence of multiple visits over several years. Carbon dating of the fire rings showed they'd been used repeatedly, and soil samples contained traces of accelerants that suggested the fires had been used for more than just warmth or cooking. But it was the seventh discovery that changed everything about their understanding of what Mahler had been doing in the woods. Oakes led them to what appeared to be just another cluster of trees. Unremarkable, except for their arrangement in a rough semicircle. When the ground-penetrating radar was brought in, it revealed the terrible truth. They weren't standing in a forest clearing, they were standing in a graveyard. 12 distinct signatures, the technician reported, studying the radar display. All approximately 6 feet down, all roughly the same size and orientation. This isn't random burial, this is systematic. The excavation took 3 days and required specialists from the State Forensic Laboratory. What they found beneath the peaceful forest floor was evidence of a killing spree that had gone undetected for years. 12 bodies, all female, all between the ages of 16 and 35, buried with the same careful precision that had marked the ritual display they'd first discovered. Curtis Brome was never the victim, Clara realized as the scope of Mahler's activities became clear. He was going to be the next perpetrator. Mahler was recruiting him, drawing him into whatever this ritual represents. The investigation eventually revealed that Mahler had been targeting isolated, vulnerable individuals, people like Curtis, whose disappearances might not be immediately reported or thoroughly investigated. He'd been building a network of accomplices, each one responsible for finding and preparing victims for his ritualistic murders. The symbols, the precise arrangements, the ceremonial aspects, the FBI's behavioral analyst explained, they're all part of a belief system that Mahler developed over years of isolation and obsession. He convinced himself that these murders were serving some greater purpose, some cosmic plan that required precise execution and specific timing. Throughout the investigation, Oakes remained Clara's constant companion and most reliable source of evidence. His ability to detect buried remains and trace evidence that human investigators missed had been crucial to understanding the full scope of Mahler's crimes. More than once, Clara found herself wondering what they would have missed if Oakes hadn't been there to guide them to the truth. The trial, when it finally came, was a media sensation that drew attention from across the country. Mahler's defense team attempted to argue mental incompetence, but the meticulous planning and sophisticated execution of his crimes argued against any claim of insanity. The ritualistic elements and careful preservation of evidence suggested someone who knew exactly what he was doing and why. Claire and Oakes testified about their role in discovering the crime scene and apprehending the suspect. As she sat in the witness box, describing how Oakes had led them from one discovery to the next, Clara couldn't help but reflect on the partnership that had made their success possible. Officer Vaughn, the prosecutor asked during her testimony, in your professional opinion, would these crimes have been discovered without your canine partner's intervention? Clara looked down at Oakes, who sat at perfect attention beside the witness stand, and thought about all the victims who might never have been found, all the families who might never have gotten closure, all the future victims who had been saved by one dog's extraordinary abilities. No, she answered simply. Without Oakes, those women would still be missing. Their families would still be wondering what happened to them, and Joseph Mahler would still be free to continue his killing. The conviction, when it came, was unanimous and swift. Mahler was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole for the 12 murders they could prove, with additional sentences for kidnapping, assault, and a dozen other charges. But for Clara, the real victory wasn't the legal outcome. It was the knowledge that 12 families finally had answers, and that no more women would fall victim to Mahler's twisted ritual. In the months that followed, Clara and Oakes returned to their regular search and rescue duties, but their reputation had been forever changed by the Merrill Creek case. Requests for their services came from agencies across the region, all hoping to benefit from Oakes' extraordinary detection abilities and Clara's skill in interpreting his subtle communications. You know what the funny thing is, Clara said to Oakes one evening as they sat on her back porch, watching the sun set over the mountains. Everyone talks about what an amazing nose you have, how you can detect things no human could find, but that's not what makes you special. Oakes tilted his head, ears forward in the attentive posture that always made Clara feel heard and understood. What makes you special, she continued, scratching behind his ears, is that you never give up. Even when everyone else thinks you're wrong, even when the evidence doesn't make sense, you keep following your instincts until you find the truth. That's not just training, that's character. The Belgian Malinois pressed against her side, content in the knowledge that his work had mattered, that the bond between them had served a purpose greater than either could have achieved alone. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Clara reflected on the nature of partnership and trust. In a world where technology and forensic science seemed to solve most crimes, there was still something irreplaceable about the connection between a dedicated handler and a working dog who refused to quit until the job was done. The Merrill Creek case had taught her that sometimes the most important discoveries came not from following procedures or protocols, but from trusting the instincts of a partner who saw the world differently than she did. Oakes had led her to the truth not because he was trained to find it, but because he was determined to find it. And, in the end, that determination had made all the difference. Have you ever witnessed an animal sense something that humans completely missed? The bond between search and rescue teams and their canine partners goes beyond training. It's built on absolute trust and an understanding that sometimes our four-legged companions perceive truths that remain invisible to us. What would you do if you were in Clara's position, following a dog deeper into dark woods based purely on his instincts? Would you trust your partner's nose over what your eyes could see, even when it led you into danger? If this story of canine heroism and the unbreakable bond between handler and dog moved you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another incredible tale of courage and partnership. Share this video with anyone who appreciates the extraordinary abilities of working dogs and the dedicated handlers who trust them with their lives. Check out our previous canine stories appearing on your screen now. And remember, sometimes the greatest heroes walk on four legs and solve mysteries that would stump the most experienced human investigators. We'll see you in the next video with another amazing story of service, dedication, and the remarkable bond between humans and their canine partners.